Hello, it is Jo from Minerva and I'm here today to do part 2 of our sewing machine feet tutorial, where we look at different types of sewing machine feet. In part 1 we looked at the basic sewing machine feet that you might use regularly or that you might ordinarily have that came with your machine. So presser feet that deal with putting in zips, doing buttonholes, adding a button, and a straight and a zigzag one. I also checked out a little overcast foot, so if you want to know how to use that, go back to part 1. Today we're going to look at some slightly different ones that are specific to specific tasks. If you are looking to buy a sewing machine foot because you want to do a particular task or use a particular sewing skill, then we always recommend and advise that you get a machine foot that is specific to your sewing machine manufacturer. They fit better, they sew better, they don't rattle around, so it's a good idea to search out the one that you really need for your machine. When you start to experiment with different types of fabrics, then you might find that you're not getting so much success with your sewing quality and stitch quality on your machine. So you might need to check out a different foot for a different type of fabric. The walking foot needs to be attached with the screw on the presser foot shank. And this little lever here goes over the little bar and you tighten it here with the lower screw. So now what happens is you've got feed dogs in the bottom, and underneath this foot is a little set of plastic feed dogs. So now you've got two lots of feed dogs that are working together, and that takes the fabric through really evenly. It's a little bit noisier because there's more mechanical things moving, but it's really great if you've got a thick fabric. So this has got a piece of foam inside, or if you were making something quilted like a quilted jacket, or you were quilting a bedspread. So it sews a straight stitch and takes the top and the bottom fabric through using the feed dog that's under here and the feed dog that's in the foot plate. It doesn't normally come with your machine, it's normally an additional extra, and it's quite pricey, but if you're quilting or enjoying making things with extra layers in, it really is useful. I know my friend, she uses hers lots more than me. She uses it as her main sewing machine foot and changes it out otherwise. So that's how it works. When this is over the shank and the needle's going up and down, it moves these plastic feed dogs up and down. It's really good if you're quilting because it takes the top and the bottom layer through the machine at the same rate, so you don't drag the top layer and get little puckers while the underside is flat. This is a walking foot. If you're not ready to invest in a walking foot, you could try a roller foot, which does a similar thing but not quite as well. The roller foot has a little textured ball in the bottom, a little barrel, and that rolls the fabric through. So if you've got a thick fabric, like the one with the piece of foam in, the roller is rolling with that textured surface to keep pushing this fabric through. It's not quite as effective as a walking foot, but it's really useful for quilting. It's particularly useful for any shiny fabric. So if you're sewing with faux leather, a waterproof fabric, say, that goes inside a wash bag, because there's nothing to grip on those fabrics. They're very smooth. So this little textured roller will roll the fabric through and try and attempt to bring it through as the same rate as the feed dogs underneath. So no puckers there. The next couple of feet are for putting your stitch line in a very particular place. So check out these 2 feet. One of them I wish I used a little bit more. And now that I've been rooting around in my tin with my presser feet in, I think I'm going to get it out much more. This is the stitch in the ditch foot. And it has a little plough that runs down the centre of the foot. It's a thin piece of metal, sometimes called an edge-to-edge foot. You just need to make sure that your needle is clearing it in the centre. Okay, so if you stitch in the ditch, you just want to line that up. My blade is going to run along this seam. So I get my row of stitching just inside the seam, and that acts as a bit of a guide, and it peels open the groove of the seam. So that's useful if you're putting on waistbands. Some people use it for top stitching because they use that as a guide from the previous row of top stitching and then measure along to the next one, so they're using it as a sort of seam guide. This is also a stitch in the ditch foot or an edge-to-edge foot. So on this one, it's got a little shape here, and this is adjustable. So I prefer this one to the other one. The other one's got a little bit bent actually, so it's not massively accurate anymore. But this one's great because I can do a row of stitching here in line with this foot, and then I can take it out and do a second row of stitching. So if I need 2 lines of top stitching and I'm not using a twin needle, or you can't use a twin needle on your machine, it works really well. So this time I'm going to have a row of stitching here, and I'm going to run the edge of this foot in this stitch. And it means I can get top stitching that is really, really accurate from the seam line. So my top stitching is an equal distance away. I want to do a second line of top stitching. So this time I'm going to run the little gripper along my previous row. And here are the 2 lines of top stitching, and they're a really equal distance apart because I used the one edge to measure against the previous row. I must use that foot more actually. I think I could get much more accurate stitching on my jeans making. If you like to do quilting and any kind of patchwork, then you might need a different sort of foot, and there are quite a few types of accessory that will help you to get accurate seam lines if you're quilting or doing patchwork. This is my 1/4 inch quilting foot, and it means I can just use the edge of the foot Quilting has much narrower seam allowances because there's no fitting room required. It's not giving you a little bit of just in case room. So if I sew a whole quilt together or whole blocks, patchwork blocks together using the same foot, then every seam allowance will be exactly the same, meaning I can piece my blocks together accurately after each block is made. I've also used this foot with delicate fabrics because it's got a small hole in it and lots of metal area holding down the fabric to stop it getting sucked down into the foot plate. So that is my 1/4 inch quilting foot. If you enjoy quilting or you want to do a slightly bigger quilted project, then you can attach this seam guide. So it's not a foot as such, it's more an accessory, and it goes in the back of the foot shank here. So at the back of my foot shank here, there's a little opening. It's a little black hole, a hole in some black plastic. And from the other side, I'm going to push the axle into the hole. You can see it coming out now. There we go. And then this little paddle is used to mark seam lines on your fabric. I'll show you how it works. You can use the paddle to choose a stitch length off your foot plate. So if you want your stitch lines to be 1 inch apart, you can line that up with the 1 inch bar. And I've got a little combination here of fabric, wadding and more fabric. So after I've done my first row of stitching, I can then use the guide bar to run the bar along this row of stitching. So I'm not even really looking where I'm stitching. I'm more looking to check that this little paddle is running along my stitch line. And then I move along to do the next row. So these will all now be 1 inch apart. And you can keep quilting a whole area. It's really useful for if you're making a quilted jacket like the Hovia jacket and you're trying to wad 2 pieces of fabric together, your outer and your liner. Essentially, it's creating this type of fabric, which is a ready to buy fabric from our website, which is a quilted poly cotton. But you can do this yourself if you've got an accurate way of adding the lines of stitching. You can change the presser foot to make different types of hem. So we're going to look at a couple of feet that are for putting a hem on your garments. This is a rolled hem foot and I've had mixed success with it. Sometimes it's great if the fabric is cut on the cross grain. So you've cut your skirt on the straight grain and then you're sewing across the cross grain. As soon as I've started to try and do curves with it, like on ruffles or flounces, then it tends to sort of slip out. So let me show you how it works. Then you can have a little test if you've got one and you weren't sure what it was. So it clips underneath, threads to the back, and it takes a little bit of starting, because what you need to do is you need to get the edge of your fabric to roll in that little curl at the front. The start is always really tricky. That's exactly what happens to me. It sort of chews up my fabric at the beginning. And I find it hard to get it started. So let's try again. Okay, I've got it going. So then you need to be guiding this raw edge and keeping that curl going. If you hold it very flat and pointing downhill, it'll keep slipping out of the curl. So you have to sort of hold the fabric up 1 inch or so here. But it does so really, really close to the edge and it rolls over the hem. And you can see I've got sort of 50% of that good between there and there, not great. At the start again, it's really hard to get it going. But once you get it going, it's fabulous and I really want to use it more. Maybe I need to practice a little bit more. So that is a rolled hem foot. To make a blind hem, I'm going to go back to my blind hemming foot, which I sometimes use as a top stitching foot because I can use that adjustable guide to line up a row of top stitching against a row that I've already done. So it's useful for 2 jobs, but really it's a blind hemming foot, and you'll need to use a blind hemming stitch. So here's my fabric. I've pressed it to make a double folded hem, and now I'm going to fold back the fabric and reveal a little bit of that press that I've just made. A blind hemming stitch has a zigzag and a straight stitch combined, so the straight stitching will be on the hem and this little zigzag part will just nick your main fabric and make a tiny little stitch that holds it all together. The setup is really key, so you need to use your hand wheel to see where the V part of the stitch will land. Now that's too much of my fabric, so I'm going to take it up and I just want to nick this main part of the fabric, and then I'm going to use the bar and make sure that that's following the fold. So your bar is touching the double fold and your needle is just nicking onto the main part of your fabric. So here you can see where the V stitch has just collected the fabric, and here is the pattern of the stitch, and then from the right side you'll just see the tiniest little bit of thread. You can get that as small as you can while you're nicking the fabric. It's better on a pattern fabric. On a plain fabric you're probably best to hand sew, and then when you press it that will appear flat. You can just see those tiny little stitches. And that's how you use a blind hemming foot, but it's also a really useful foot for doing lots of sort of work where you want to change and guide your stitching. The next foot is for a very specific job. So this one is for adding a bias binding to the edge of a project. If you've just got a little bit to do, then you can probably do a one pass and a hand stitch, or 2 passes on the machine. But this is great if you are sewing big pieces, big lengths of bias binding. This is a bias foot, so this applies bias binding. And you put it on like you did before, and you've got a little plastic section here and down this hole here. In there is where you put your fabric and the binding folded over the fabric edge, and then you can adjust this little plastic barrel here, and that will guide the bias binding through evenly. And you can also change the position here. It's quite a specific foot, but I did do quite a lot of quilting at one stage and it was brilliant for binding the edge of double quilts. Again, it's tricky to get started because you're trying to get this piece of bias binding into that little slot, but once you've got it in and you've adjusted the width here between this little plastic barrel here and the edge, once you've got that nice and accurate, you can get your stitch right on the very edge of the binding. So this attaches the bias binding as you put the fabric through the machine, but you've got to, I can do it now, it's attached, so you've got to get the fabric into this slot here. So it's slightly trickier to use, another one that gets better with practice, but it's very good if you're doing oven gloves, homeware. Binding the edge of quilt is absolutely excellent, and because it really gets close to the edge and you don't miss the back of the fabric. Adding 2 layers of gathering stitches to draw up when you're making a tier or a tiered dress or skirt can be a little bit irksome, so you've got to try and make sure that you don't break the threads. So let's have a look at a gathering foot. This is a gathering foot. It's like a little foot paddle. It's got a groove underneath for attaching the ruffle to your piece of fabric, some clip on and some you screw on to the shank. To use the gathering foot, you will need to adjust your tension. So I'm going to take my tension quite tight, but I'll show you what it's like on 4, which is your normal tension, and then I'll move towards a higher number and my gather will get more and more pronounced. I need to be on a straight stitch. If I make the stitch longer and tighter, it will gather up even more. So you'll need to experiment on a piece of fabric before you gather your actual piece. When I sew on a 4.5 length and just a normal tension, I get a very slight gather. If I change my tension to 5, the fabric will gather up more. I've now changed it to 6. And I will get more gather, and so on. Let's take a look. So with my tension on 4, it starts to ruche up the fabric. On 5, I get a sort of even gather, something you might have maybe on a shoulder. On 6, I'm really pleating up the fabric to turn it this way. On 7, I'm absorbing a lot of fabric there. And on 8, I change the stitch length to 5, and you can see it's really bunching up the fabric, but very nice and evenly. So that is how you use a gathering foot in the first instance. This foot can work twofold when you have a piece of fabric on the bottom that you're going to gather, and then in the top you place the fabric that you're going to attach the gather to. I've moved the needle to the left position. I'm going to put the needle down through the 2 layers of fabric and set my stitch length to 4 and my stitch tension to 6. And now it has gathered the fabric and attached it to my garment piece all at the same time. It's a great way to make children's dresses, skirts and ruffles and tiers. It's really good for the Lyra skirt and dress if you're making the tiered versions. Obviously you're going to have to work out the ratio of how much fabric you need, because if you draw gathering threads up you can adjust them and change the length. So if you want to get at least double the amount of fabric as your gathering strip, so that you'll have enough, because you don't want to attach it and get all the way to the end and you've run out of fabric. So that is a gathering foot, which you might want to experiment with. If you can drop the feed dogs on your machine, then you can start to use free motion sewing. So that's where you can move the fabric around in any direction, but you can only do this if you have a drop the feed dog feature on your machine and that you have the right foot to do this job. You will only use this darning foot or free motion foot if you can drop the feed dogs on your machine. So at the moment, that's a ridge of metal sticking up and it's ready to grip the fabric and move it along. I can drop the feed dogs. So now they're down and out of the way and they're out of action, which means now I can move the fabric at whatever pace I would like. It's a tricky thing to get on because you need to put this through the screw in the shank and you need this pin to go over the top of the screw at the top, and I'll show you that now. So the little stick at the top goes over this bar, but at the same time it goes round the shank. you can follow different shapes, and it's much freer way to use your sewing machine. But you can only do it with this foot, and you can only do it if you can drop the feed dogs on your machine, and not all machines do that. I keep all of my sewing machine feet in a little tin so that I know where they all are, and actually I'm going to try and use some of them a little bit more than I have done. Practice makes perfect, and if the more you use them, the more they will become part of something that you reach for when you're sewing. If you have any questions about sewing machine feet, you can leave those below. If you have an ingenious way of using a particular foot to do a particular job, we would love to hear about that too. And we'd also like to see your garments and makes over on our website. So do make an account for yourself and upload your photos and descriptions, and we would love to read what you have been making. Thank you very much for watching. Do call again for more tutorials, sew alongs, fabric pairing and fabric focus videos soon.